think I want to start with question number 3. How do you think Jack Johnson defines manhood? What is the definition of manhood for him as you see it play out in his life?
Basically, that like anyone dictate like who he is and like who he's around.
Okay. So it's something that he's going to define for himself. No one else could dictate what manhood meant. Again, these terms, and a lot of terms, when we think about them, are things like when we look back at the Confederate flag, right? They're symbols. Words are often symbols. They have a certain meaning, and we invest in with that meaning. Society invested with that meaning. So a term like manhood means a lot of different things at different moments. It actually goes through tremendous changes. Actually, the category of manhood in the world, and in the United States in particular, is going through tremendous changes between the 1890s and the 1920s. You actually saw the creation of the term masculinity. People stopped talking about manhood, and they start talking about something called masculinity. And so some would say that boxing, the heavyweight champion was the emperor of masculinity. It's interesting. There are whole books on this subject. Certain people talk about how manhood went from meaning one thing to meaning something very different. So in the 1860s, 1870s, manhood meant this kind of reserved, dignified, never lose your cool, never lose your temper, like never let them see you sweat kind of thing. But then by the 1890s, a lot of people, especially in this country, noticed that masculinity seemed to mean something very different. It seemed to mean the ability to defend yourself, physically if necessary, stand up for your rights in a certain way. Not just black manhood, I'm talking about manhood generally. So men were known to overreact when disrespected on a certain level. And this is not just true for the 1890s, but you see an increase in men using violence to solve issues, or like honor, this notion of honor. So if someone disrespects you, you challenge them to a duel. Like, you disrespected me, let's get pistols and stand out in the street and somebody's going to die. That's pretty extreme when you think about how one thinks about defending their honor. So even when we think about maybe some of the problems of exaggerated masculinity today, I've got to realize that there's a longer history to this, and it's not just about African Americans. So it's interesting to see some of the changes that it's going to go through. President Theodore Roosevelt would say that American men in particular, had become too effeminate. They were too weak, and they needed to find ways to kind of, man up, basically. And so that's why you see all these pictures of Roosevelt, who had been very sickly in his childhood, recreating his own masculinity. He goes on safaris and hunts, tigers and lions and all these pictures of him standing on, very kind of masculine sort of things. And that really becomes identified with this entire region. Fits the same time period. It's really interesting to think about how it fits the same time period. But then how might black manhood be even more complicated based on some of the things we've talked about, right? Lynching is obviously a challenge to black manhood and masculinity. So it's interesting, like you said, that Johnson is really going to take his own definition, make his own definition. And the point you make is an important one. He didn't care who had a problem with it, white folks or black folks. And you see some of that here, and there's actually more in the rest of that first part of this documentary. He has problems. Both Booker T. Washington and Du Bois would criticize Jack Johnson. It's funny, they're debating each other, but both of them are like, this dude's a little out there. Both of them really have a kind of secret praise for him, but they're like, what you're doing is dangerous. So Washington, criticizes him openly. He shouldn't be doing this, blah, blah, blah. Du Bois and James Weldon Johnson and others criticize him for running around with white women. They say, look, if you can't find a good black woman, you need to just remain celibate, like you said. At the same time, Booker T. Washington had, radio set up and speakers set up at Tuskegee to broadcast his fight when it was happening. So there's this kind of admiration, but there's also this like, look, man, you're in a certain position. You need to carry yourself a certain way. And maybe both of them are right in a sense. Maybe both of them are wrong in a sense. People do die after Jack Johnson fights. Black folks celebrate, and there are race riots. Folks literally lose their lives. So that comes up. I don't know if you saw that much of it yet, but that comes up later on. Some writers are like, hey, if a couple of us got to die because we are defending our manhood, then so be it. Some other folks say, look, we need to sort of do this in a certain way so that people don't, lose their life over a sporting event, basically. Really, really interesting to think about how he becomes so symbolic of so much else. So how else do you see him defining manhood? What does he do or say that shows you his definition, his personal definition? I mean, Jack Johnson was good because he actually gives us verbal definitions, but he also shows you in his life. So what is his definition of manhood as you see it? And what do you think about it? What else? We've got one good definition.
When he was boxing or practicing with
So that okay. Yeah, that one I read this book, actually a book called Manliness and Civilization, believe it or not. And there's a chapter in it on Jack Johnson. It's by a historian named Gail Biederman, and she writes about. She's like, what better example to look at than this guy? So she talks about the whole gauze and exaggerating his masculinity, his sexual prowess in a certain way. Again, think about the moment that he's doing that. I mean, he's doing that at a moment that this is what lynching is all about, right? So it's really, really interesting to say the least for him to exaggerate that and to kind of play on that, play on those fears that were very real that he knew all too well. Were real fears. So the kind of sexual aspect of it, we think about masculinity as competition between men. That's part of it. But it's also about men competing with each other about women, or sometimes even domination of women, unfortunately. It can be one of the problems of masculinity, especially exaggerated masculinity. Sometimes men, when they feel like they've been challenged, especially by women, sometimes lose their mind completely. So it's interesting to think about playing with the notions of sex and sexuality. Anything else, you guys?
He dresses like a way, finely.
Okay, good. Yeah, when he dresses, right? He's all the name brands, right? Fur coats. They when you saw Jack Johnson riding around town, if you did see him, you might just see a cloud of dust. But he's speeding in these expensive cars, wearing fur coats and hats and gold fronts. I mean, he was really playing with notions of masculinity and class, right? He said, "Look, I got money. Care what you think about me." Did you get to the part about his speeding ticket? Yeah. So again, you think about how he would negotiate with power, right? The legal system is the embodiment of power. Yeah, I was speeding. It was 100. I don't have change. That's all right. I'm gonna come back. I'm still gonna be speeding. Just go ahead and keep it. I mean, think about how over the top that is at the turn of the 20th century. That's over the top now, right? But that would be definitely over the top in this period to think about him and his. And in some respects, that we've seen this behavior before, right? In the Ethnic Notions video, remember when guy talking about it goes to the bar, the actor, famous actor that has all kinds of money but still has to deal with Jim Crow. He goes to the bar and he's talking about how he asks for a bourbon. And the guy says, "Yeah, that'd be $500 or something, or something ridiculous." No, so $50. And so he puts $500 in the bar and says, "Give me 10." And he's kind of laughing about it, but he's also thinking about how painful in a way it is. So this is one way of responding, maybe humorously, to something that's not so funny. And something that could be dangerous in a sense. But it also tells you something about class. Most African American men in this period would not be able to negotiate the color line in the same way as a Jack Johnson because they wouldn't have had his class status. They wouldn't have had his class status. So that raises some other issues. We talk about how race, class, and gender all come together. I mean, they all come together in a figure like Jack Johnson, who was male, right? Who was upper class after a while, and he was African American. So these things, I mean, there are these larger issues that really come out of this. Anything else? One of the key themes then I mentioned below that is his relation to the Washington Du Bois debate. How do you see Jack Johnson relating to the Washington Du Bois debate? We kind of talked about the masculinity one theme. How do you see him fit in this debate? Right, if they're both responding to the race problem, how does he respond to the race problem?
Well, I thought he's probably more on Du Bois' side, so.
He could be more on Du Bois' side. This is good. I want you to sort of think about the two extremes and try to figure out where he might fit. Why? Why do you think he's more on the Du Boisian side?
Because he's a new Negro, so he's saying that he can be anybody who he wants to be, though.
Okay.
And it doesn't like this to have other people tell him what to do, just like Du Bois is, or something similar to what Du Bois was trying to say.
So yeah, I would say on one level, yeah, that seems to fit perfectly. Nobody is going to define you but you. You're an individual. I mean, you can assert your manhood despite the fact that others might want to limit it. I can play devil's advocate with that too. And Washington thought of himself as a new Negro. A lot of folks thought that he wasn't, but he thought of himself as a new Negro too. He said, "Look, I'm going to kill this old Negro stereotype by working hard, right, defeating stereotypes of the lazy, poor African American. Washington would say, look, Jack Johnson got some money. Therefore got some power. Now, Washington would have wanted him maybe to do something a little different, maybe with that money and power. But it's interesting to think how both those figures, Washington and Du Bois, would have thought of themselves as challenging the old Negro. But you're right. Traditionally, most folks think of Du Bois more in that role, especially a kind of militancy, so maybe not giving into Jim Crow in that way. Other thoughts on that debate?
I thought it would be more of Booker T. Washington.
More like Booker T? How come?
He fought his way to success.
Okay.
He worked. He had a skill. It wasn't, in the classroom, but he fought like nobody gave him anything.
Okay. So he's going to earn everything, hard work, right? These are some of the themes that come out of Washington. Find your skill. And again, in some ways, that maybe takes us back to Du Bois, too. A talent to find your particular skill. But yeah, it's definitely about skill. I mean, like I said before, he's working with his hands, for real. And he says, look, you're going to respect me because of what I can do. He also had the other intellectual side, too. But yeah, what he's known for is he's a boxer. He's a prize fighter. And this is going to be his way of making a living. So that does dovetail in many ways with what Washington argued. Make a living. Right? Do that first and foremost. Anything else? Maybe that'd be some more reactions. What does he say specifically about race? I'll ask you some more specific questions then. What does Jack Johnson have to say specifically about race? He says a few things in the last couple of minutes there. Because people start asking him, what do you think about the race problem? How do you do this as a black man? Media was particularly important. So how does he respond to those questions?
I think he was talking about in the video, he said he ignored it, he pretended it wasn't there.
Yeah, that's an interesting response. In some ways, he says, "Look, I forgot his exact quote. He used a big word. He says, I've always found a way to pretend as if race did not exist." Right? That's an interesting response, especially in 1903, 1905, the 1890s. Folks around you getting lynched, race riots, trying to get voted on. Just not pretending race doesn't exist. In some ways, maybe that's what Washington is going to do too. Right? At least on its face, it doesn't exist. Just go about your business, handle this. I'm just going to be me. Right? They're going to do what they do. It's really interesting. It seems to work for him. It seems to work for him. Jack Johnson lives well into the 1950s. Not to ruin it, there's a whole part 2 of this. I want you to watch part 1. The first hour and a half. It kind of ends when he gets his championship. And you've seen more than half of it. But he lives well into the 1950s. Any guess on how he dies?
I think he died in a car accident.
Yeah, he dies in a car accident. Those fast cars he was driving ultimately kills him. But it's, in some ways, to me, surprising that he done died some other way. There were folks at his fights with pistols. All right, you get to the part where the guy wants to break in his house.
Yeah.
After he wins a fight, a guy with a gun tries to break in his house, and the cops stop the guy. And there are several moments where he could have and probably should have lost his life based on the averages and based on how the society was.
People that wanted to kill him at the Jeffrey fight.
Mm-hmm. The 10,000 folks that did not want him to win were willing to do various things to make sure that didn't happen. I can't imagine the amount of death threats. We hear about death threats for athletes much later, 1960s and 70s, and even today. So you can imagine the kind of stuff he dealt with based on some of the things he was doing. But again, as a particular response, and again, think about these responses. Not all new Negroes are going to respond the same way. Not all new Negro men are going to respond the same way. We're going to counter this with some of Marcus Garvey, for example. See how those two definitions of new Negro manhood might look similar or might look very different. Mm-hmm.
I was going to ask, do you think that has something to do with what's going on today with the Indiana law now?
This is a good question. You anticipate some of the questions I want to think about with Jack Johnson. I do think we can use Jack Johnson and his story at that moment to look at various things happening later on. Actually, I have a series of short answer questions I'm going to have you answer about this Jack Johnson documentary after you finish watching it. And one of them does have to do with these questions of things, more recent political questions like same-sex marriage or how folks are treated or mistreated in law. Because a lot of folks have made those parallels. A lot of folks have made those parallels as to what he was willing to do in challenging certain accepted notions at the time. And that raises a point. You haven't seen it yet. It comes up more in the second part of this video. they laws would be developed to stop Jack Johnson's behavior. This was not just a matter of people didn't want him to win. Laws get changed, particularly around Jack Johnson. At least a couple. You saw one, I think, when they talked about laws against showing fight films. He starts knocking people out, and people say this is going to be the end of society if we don't stop people from. People used to go to movie theaters and watch these things, right? Not just the thousands of people at the fight, but millions of people perhaps ultimately in movie theaters. So they stopped showing for a while. In addition, and maybe even bigger, 1910, I think it is, 1912, somewhere around there, a law called the Mann Act would be passed, M-A-N-N. Interesting, not about manhood, but the senator's name was Mann. The Mann Act gets passed in 1910 or 11, something like that. What this law was for was to stop what was called white slave traffic. White slave traffic. What that term meant was really what we now would call sort of sex trafficking, trafficking in women. There's an international problem, national problem with women, especially being sold for sexual purposes. At the time, there were all these stories about white women being kidnapped, abducted, used for prostitutes, sold into slavery. A lot of it's interesting. It's very racialized the way that it was thought about in the society at the time. A lot of these stories and things that got told were about Chinese immigrants kidnapping white women and Mexican immigrants kidnapping white women. In this case, it crystallizes around Jack Johnson. Remember, he's dating and even marries some white women and does various things. He hung out with some women that had worked as prostitutes. So they basically make a law saying, look, if you take these women across state lines, you're violating now federal law. And he gets in trouble for this, even though he knows the women, they weren't, he wasn't pimping or anything like that. But that's basically how it gets prosecuted. And Jack Johnson has to leave the country for a while. He's on the run. He goes, interestingly enough, to Europe and some of the other places, and eventually comes back, gets a plea deal or whatever. But this really kind of cost him his title at the height of his career. So it's interesting to think about how the society saw him as so dangerous to change the law and to prosecute him based on these laws. Again, and that raises the point about, thinking about current laws and debates over current laws today, like what's going on with Indiana. How they're about to cost themselves a lot of money at this point, especially with the Final Four in town. So think about a lot of these connections between past and present, and politics and culture. Right? You're already anticipating some of the things we're going to be looking at for the rest of the semester. Mm-hmm.
What do you think about that, though? What do you think about that, though?
What do I think about it?
Yeah.
You'll try to get me in trouble. I always focus, I study history. So I find it interesting when laws are passed in whatever arena that remind me of things I've seen before, especially racialized things I've seen before. I also find it interesting the language that gets used to talk about it. I always, pushing you guys to focus on the language. So one of the things that intrigued me at first was the idea that the way that the battle is being phrased. So those in favor of the law are saying it's about religious freedom. Right? We saw this a few years ago in the 1990s when I was in graduate school, and there was a whole movement against affirmative action. Right? They used the rhetoric of Martin Luther King to say you should get rid of affirmative action, a program that was designed to deal with racism. Suddenly became racist in the minds of people. Right? They're saying this is racist, get rid of it, blah blah blah. I find it interesting, that that's how it gets couched. It's about religious freedom because everybody, every American is in favor of religious freedom, right? In theory, it's one of our ideals. And so people are smart enough to kind of use that in a way that's going to be very discriminatory and hurtful towards groups of people. But it can get complicated, right? If you are of a certain religious belief, whether conservative or not, you may agree with some of the tenets of the law. And then you hear this notion of religious freedom, it gets really complicated. I tend to be very suspicious of that because I've seen it too many times. I was at UCLA when they actually abolished affirmative action. When I went to UCLA undergrad, they had an affirmative action program in place. We'll talk more about this because it's closer to the end of the class. But then when I went back to graduate school, they no longer had that program. So I had the benefit of seeing before and after. There were major protests around it, About a dozen of my friends went to jail protesting. I got stun gun and pepper spray by police spent the weekend in jail, that kind of stuff. So this is serious stuff, politically speaking. But it's interesting how folks might use or misuse history around that purpose too. All of a sudden, affirmative action became about reverse racism, when really the group that benefited the most from affirmative action had been women. Right? Universities are now more than 50% female. Whereas before the 1970s, that wasn't the case. Women weren't really allowed, or they were limited, still limited in certain areas. So it's interesting to think about how arguments get made, and that's all I'll say about that for now. We'll come back to it though, so I want to think about these contemporary issues. There are a couple of key quotes on the bottom of that page, and what I was trying to do with those quotes was to, some of them are, one of them is actually the quote you just raised. I have found no better way of avoiding race prejudice than to act with people of other races as if prejudice did not exist. That's a quote by Jack Johnson. But some of the others were intended to make you think about the role of media and how he's going to be portrayed, because we'll spend some time talking about the role of media. What should media do? In many ways, media can be a positive thing, but in other ways, it might be negative. We saw in the ethnic notions how a lot of those images are media images that were seen as very negative of African Americans. And so those first two quotes are from newspapers, and they're not always the kindest portrayals of Jack Johnson. I know the Tommy Burns fight, they say, quote, was the first battle in an inevitable race war. So they literally saw this fight between him and Tommy Burns as perhaps the first shot in this coming. Some folks were really serious about this. This is going to be blood in the streets because there's a black champion. All of a sudden, darker peoples around the world who are a world majority, a lot of folks have long been nervous about that. What if they get together? What if they decide they're not going to take it anymore? Not just black people. We're talking about all folks, all sorts of folks, all sorts of people of color. This was a tension at the time. Some say it's a tension now if you read certain stories about the browning of America. Right? African Americans aren't even the largest minority group anymore in the United States. What does that mean? We really need to think in complicated ways about race and American identity, what that means, what it should mean, and how people get nervous around those issues. Mm-hmm. Of the questions?
Yeah.
I thought I did, but I do not. But I have something better I'm going to give you momentarily. I did put it on the blackboard, but I'm going to give you something more specific that I want you to look at. Anyway, that's the same thing. Sort of picks up on your question, in fact. This is a list of 5 questions. 5 questions related to Unforgivable Blackness documentary. I want you to answer your chance to put some points in. Go to the Dropbox. And have them answer them. It does require that you see it to the end of this first part. So I'm not going to make it due till Tuesday. We'll do till Tuesday, but you'll see how the things we just discussed, some of the questions you just raised, come up and come out of this. Again, be thinking about how we're doing multiple things at once. Right? Be thinking about how we're doing multiple things at once and how they fit together. Maybe even more important, how they fit together. Two things I want to do real quick. The chapter 15 PowerPoint I put up, actually a lot of these concepts we ended up talking about last class.